She was fast asleep in seat 8A, the hum of the engines lulling her into a rare moment of peace. The flight was supposed to be routine, nothing more than a few hours in the air before touching down at the next city. Passengers scrolled through their phones, sipped coffee, and settled into the quiet rhythm of the journey. But halfway across the sky, the calm was broken. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but edged with urgency, asking a question no one expected to hear. At 30,000 feet, are there any trained combat pilots on board? Heads turned, whispers spread through the cabin, and tension gripped the air. Something was happening beyond those locked cockpit doors. And suddenly, every passenger realized this flight was not as ordinary as they thought. In 8A, the woman stirred awake, rubbing her eyes, unaware that all eyes were shifting toward her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but no one yet knew her past, or why fate had placed her on this flight at this exact moment. The captain's request hung in the silence like a lifeline, waiting for someone to answer. Every second felt heavier than the last. Was this a technical failure, a medical emergency, or something far worse? The woman in 8A straightened in her seat, her heartbeat quickening as memories she thought she had left behind came rushing back. The question now wasn't whether a combat pilot was on board, it was whether she was ready to reveal herself. The woman in 8A sat upright now, her hands gripping the armrests as she tried to steady her breathing. She hadn't expected to hear words like that ever again, not after leaving the service years ago. Once, she had been one of the best combat pilots in her unit, trusted to fly missions in the most dangerous skies. But those days were behind her at least. That's what she had told herself. The life she lived now was quieter, far removed from the adrenaline and responsibility of split-second decisions. Yet here she was, trapped in a metal tube above the clouds, with hundreds of strangers unknowingly depending on her choice. The cabin crew moved quickly, their voices low but urgent as they whispered to each other. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, some clutching their phones, even though there was no signal. Something was definitely wrong in the cockpit, and the captain's voice had carried the weight of a problem bigger than a simple malfunction. She glanced out the window, the endless stretch of sky reflecting her own uncertainty. Why was the captain asking for combat pilots specifically? This wasn't the kind of question that came up unless something extraordinary was unfolding. Her pulse quickened as she replayed the training drills in her mind. The countless hours of simulations and real flights that had once defined her life. The decision was closing in on her. She could stay silent, blending in as just another passenger. Or she could stand up and face whatever awaited at the front of the plane. The woman in 8A leaned back, trying to calm her thoughts, but the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. A mother across the aisle clutched her child tighter, whispering reassurances she didn't fully believe. A businessman in the row behind muttered about delays and lawsuits, but his nervous tapping gave away his fear. Everyone seemed to sense that whatever was happening wasn't routine. The flight attendants moved with forced composure, one of them pausing at row 8 and letting her eyes linger on the woman. It was as if she already knew. The woman wondered if her name had been flagged on the passenger list. If the captain had made that announcement knowing she was here. She hadn't flown combat missions in years, but records had a way of following you, no matter how much you wanted a quiet life. Meanwhile, whispers spread like wildfire. Some passengers speculated about a possible medical issue in the cockpit. Others whispered about hijacking, though no one dared say the word aloud. The unease grew heavier with each passing minute. The woman's mind raced back to her last mission, the sound of radio chatter, the crackle of static, the silence that followed when things went wrong. She had walked away from that life, but the weight of responsibility never fully left. Now, staring at the closed cockpit door, she knew she was facing a choice that could change everything again. And still, the captain's request echoed in her head, louder with every heartbeat. Asterisk, are there any combat pilots on board? Asterisk, the seconds stretched like hours as the plane cut through the sky, every passenger caught between silence and fear. The woman in 8A felt her palms dampen, her mind pulling her back to the cockpit simulators, where every decision meant life or death. She could almost hear her old instructor's voice reminding her that hesitation was its own kind of failure. But this wasn't training, this was real. And the stakes were higher than ever. A flight attendant finally broke the tension, stepping into the aisle with a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. Everything is under control. But her trembling hands betrayed her words. The woman in 8A caught the glance the attendant gave toward the cockpit, a glance loaded with fear. Something inside told her that time was running short. Around her, the passengers were unraveling. The man in the business suit demanded answers, his voice rising with panic. The mother began quietly crying as she held her child. Even the calmest travelers couldn't hide the unease settling over the cabin. It was no longer just a question of what was wrong, it was how much longer they could afford to wait. The woman rose slightly from her seat, her decision pressing harder against her chest. All eyes seemed to follow her as if the cabin itself knew she was different, that she might be the answer to the captain's call. The hum of the engines grew louder, almost roaring. As the moment of truth drew closer, she hesitated in the aisle, steadying herself as the plane jolted slightly, a movement sharp enough to draw gasps from several rows. The seatbelt signs flickered back on, and the captain's voice returned. this time tighter, as if every word was being measured. "We are managing a situation, but if any trained combat pilots are on board, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." The urgency was no longer hidden. It was raw and undeniable. The woman in 8A locked eyes with a flight attendant who was already moving quickly toward her, as if she'd been expecting this moment. But before she could speak, a second voice cut through the cabin. A man seated near the back stood up suddenly, his tone sharp. "I can fly," he said, his voice louder than the whispers rippling through the passengers. Heads turned toward him. He carried himself with the same confidence she recognized in herself. But something about his timing made her pulse race. Could it be true? Was there another combat pilot on board? Or was this a bluff? The tension between them filled the cabin, two strangers now drawn into a silent contest of trust and suspicion. The crew looked torn, uncertain whom to believe, their glances darting between the woman and the man as the engines hummed louder. The stakes had shifted. It wasn't only about whether she would step forward, it was about whether the right person would take control before the situation spiraled out of reach. The woman in 8A finally rose to her feet, the weight of the captain's words and the fear in the passenger's eyes giving her no choice. She stepped into the aisle just as the man from the back moved forward, the two of them facing each other like pieces on a chessboard. The flight attendant looked from one to the other, clearly desperate for answers. "I'm a former Air Force combat pilot," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. For the first time, she let her past be known. The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't argue. Then he added, "So am I." The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Before the crew could decide, the plane dipped sharply, sending trays and cups tumbling. Passengers screamed. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice broke through, strained, almost breathless. "One of our pilots is unconscious. I need backup in the cockpit now." The urgency shattered any doubt. The woman pushed forward, instincts taking over, but as she reached the cockpit door, she noticed the man wasn't following. Instead, he stood frozen, his confidence unraveling under the weight of the moment. She realized then his claim had been a bluff, a mask of bravery that couldn't hold Dot inside the cockpit. She slid into the seat, her hands moving as if the years away had never happened. The engines obeyed her touch, the aircraft steadying. Relief swept through the cabin. Yet, as the horizon leveled, her eyes caught something unusual on the radar, a second threat emerging in their path. One no one had warned them about. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the radar, heart pounding harder than it had in years. The second threat turned out not to be hostile at all. It was severe weather forming rapidly in their path, a violent storm wall stretching across the sky. The captain, still shaken, looked to her with quiet trust. Without hesitation, she adjusted their course, recalling maneuvers drilled into her long ago. Every decision was precise, every movement steady. The passengers, though unaware of the details, felt the plane smooth out beneath them, their fear slowly giving way to hope. Back in the cabin, the mother holding her child finally relaxed, whispering thanks under her breath. The businessman who had complained earlier sat quietly, humbled by the reality that his fate had rested in the hands of someone he had barely noticed at boarding. Even the flight attendants allowed themselves a small sigh of relief as the storm clouds faded behind them. When the plane finally touched down, applause erupted, not out of forma,